مساء الخير جميعا. أنا اسمي سيدحمد جوجيلي أستاذ.
Name is Sidahmed Goudjili from the Doha Institute, and it is a great pleasure and honor to welcome you to this last session of the second day of our conference, the Security and Strategic Studies, the State of the Field. Our topic is the civil-military relations, and we have a number of experts and researchers in this field. Without further ado, we will start with Dr. Abdel-Fattah Mady. And I would like to begin by introducing Dr. Abdel-Fattah Mady. He is the head of the Unit of State and Political Systems Studies at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies and editor-in-chief of Hikama Governance, a peer-reviewed journal of public administration and public policy. He obtained his PhD in political science from Claremont Graduate University. He previously worked as associate professor at political science in Alexandria University, a visiting fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, a visiting professor at Denver University, an expert at the UNDP, and a research manager at Cordoba Peace Institute in Geneva. His research focuses on regime transition and democratization, civil-military relations, Islamist movements, civil education, human rights, and academic freedoms. His latest publications include Pitfalls in Tahrir Square, Why the Egyptian Revolution Stumbled, and Democracy and Guns, Civil-Military Relations, and Reforming the Armed Forces, published by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in 2021. Dr. Abdel-Fattah, you have 20 minutes. The floor is yours, sir. Good evening, welcome everyone. I would like to thank you for this conference, Dr. Said Ahmed and Dr. Omar in particular, and for choosing this topic, because very honestly, tackling this topic is very important, the security and strategic studies, and this is key in the research conferences, albeit minimal and or rare in the Arab world. In the minutes to come, I will highlight the state of the subfield of civil-military relations in general and in the Arab world in particular. As you know, so the researchers in one of the political studies field is not something easy, because we have large quantities of studies in every subfield, and there are several subfields within the fields. Political sciences give particular attention to this aspect, and also history, sociology, and other humanities and social studies. This is why most of the literature is actually attributed to researchers from a variety of fields. I will go through some of the topics very quickly. So what is the civil-military relations? This is the first thing that we are going to talk about. What does it mean? And then the most important subfields within the civil-military relations. As you see, the points that were underlined were highly touched upon by the researchers. Military coup, and then how to control military institutions and the civil oversight of the military, and then the criticism that was addressed to these approaches, most of them the result of realities on the ground. Taking into account the time I have, I will be talking about the main points. So the civil-military relations historically, traditionally, tackle two aspects: the civil aspect and the military aspect. The civil aspect is not only restricted to heads of states or prime ministers. No, we talk about all the civil leadership in the state, and also some studies talked about the elite, be it an political elite or an economic elite, and also the civil encompasses the society. So when we talk about civilian, we do not mean to talk about the executive power only. No, we can actually talk about other subdivisions, subfields, and sub categories in this civil category. The military, we talk about the military leaders and also the military as an institution, the military elite, and then the concept expanded to include everything relating to armed institutions that include the different institutions like security institutions, security forces, and intelligence agencies. And there's a lot of diverging opinions between the researchers in this regard. Later on, there is an intertwining area between the two. Military men are carrying out civil tasks and vice versa. So we have several things to include the humanitarian assistance, peacekeeping forces, war against or war on terror, and the reconstruction efforts after conflicts, and fighting the insurgencies and states, counter-insurgency operations. So the lines have become blurred between what's civil and what's military. Based on my background in political science, focus on the literature that was in political science that gives particular attention to the relations between the political elite and the military leadership. So this is the traditional approach. So we are talking about the main questions, the main issues: who decides what and whose interest when it comes to the relation between the civil and the military. There are several definitions that tackled these points. People who focus on sociology actually focus on a higher level, talking about an intra-military relation, and also the different categories of societies. There are several literature when it comes to this. Very briefly, when we talk about the main topic, this subfield, so it became a subfield when it comes to political science and comparative political science, and also a subfield of sociology and the military sociology and other historical and legal studies. So we now have the CMR as a subfield. It was born in the United States, and the main contributions come from the States, and it developed with the practice. So it did not precede these theoretical aspects, because it came after the practice as a response to practical and empirical applications. So we have several stages that we can mention. The non-proliferation, or actually preventing the putting an end to the armament race during the Cold War and during the Korean War. For 50 years, actually, here we can say that the attention was focused on preserving a strong military capable of winning battles to protect the country against foreign assault or foreign invasion. At the same time, the military should not be a threat to the civil authority within the state. So we will see that later on it moved from domestic to international dimensions and aspects. There are some main aspects that affected this subfield, like the United States wars that were fought by the United States. The Vietnam War, of course, affected this subfield, and also one of the founding books in this field, the Samuel Huntington, about this particular topic. He was studying the North American case, and the students in this field know that he created the terms in this field and talked about the objective oversight, and also the after Huntington, there were several studies and there were several criticism. Up until today, either Samuel Huntington is criticized or his theories are built upon. So his book in 1957. And then the third world, many of the countries of the third world in the 50s and in the 60s became independent, and then they actually the interest was on the topics that these countries suffer from, particularly military coup in order to overtake power. So that was the way to tackle these relations in the third world from an institutional perspective. So the civil oversight on the military needs to be this and that, and the relation between the two needs to be so and so. So the interest focused on explaining military coup in general and studying different societies, be it military governments or the one-party government in Eastern Europe, for instance, all places suffering from divisions, ethnical or ethnic of race, etc. So the coups actually were at the core of these studies. In some countries, the coups actually started declining, and then the focus centered on the reason behind that and how were the rulers capable of controlling the military, and the strategies to control the military were very important. Part of the terms and the literature actually take into account the performance of the military in power. Some of the military managed to run the economy in a good way, some other failed. And some literature actually gives the military the role of modernization and justified its intervention in the field of politics, and also even the military that achieved at the economic level had a hefty price to be paid at the level of human rights, etc. And also there are other literature distinguishing between the different types of regimes. Very quickly, I will talk about this. So the research is part of the presentation. So very quickly, I will move until after the end of the Cold War. So the boundaries became blurry between the civil and the military, with the phenomenon of the peacekeeping forces carrying out military and non-military tasks. And what the United States did in Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, the military, the agencies, the institutions there used to carry out civilian tasks in addition to the military tasks. And there are several evidence that we can mention at this level. Some people actually talked about the third generation of the civil military relations. In this field, they talk about the fact that the military no longer plays a purely military role, but they are also talking about counterinsurgency and other areas that need to move to wider horizons. Even before Iraq and Afghanistan, there were some reconstruction efforts in Germany and Vietnam and other countries. After the Arab Spring in 2011, the Arab world opened the doors once again to studying the coups in the Arab world and the return of the military to power. In the Arab world, there are very few literature. Anwar Abdel-Malik, the Egyptian sociology expert, Nazih Ayubi, Adil Hussein, journalist in Egypt, and Yazid Sayegh and Azmi Bishara recently after the Arab Spring. So they tackled several topics. We are not going to delve into the details because we are running out of time. So these are the topics that were covered by Arab researchers one way or another, but there are several other topics that were not tackled neither by the foreigners nor by the Arabs. For instance, the control of security and intelligence agencies over military, and also the military assistance and the intra-military relations, and also the phenomenon of the relation between the military and Israel. For instance, the military council in Sudan normalized with Israel, so not the civilians. The armies that were supposed to be in clash with Israel normalized and also participated as well with the Israeli army in fighting ISIS in Sinai. And also CENTCOM and the restructuring that happened made Israel a partner in the region. So these things are absent when it comes to the literature and the effect that it has on the politics. Very quickly, I will be 5 minutes. So some of the studies in the Middle East actually focused on the role of the military as a hurdle to democratic transition and the categorization of the military. Dr. Mahran, for instance, our colleague, categorized the relations between the civil and the military and how to face it, and other studies about security, etc. After the Arab Spring, there were studies explaining the different positions of the military vis-a-vis revolutions. Some studies were actually proving that this was not correct. The military actually became against the revolution, and recently in the United States there is a talk between an alliance between the conservatives and the military. Populism and all these things affect the trends and the civil military relations. They are still being examined, and there are very recent studies about the role of the civil and the military in facing challenges like the war on terrorism and national security in the United States and other things carried out by our attacks carried out by the military institution other than its military work. There are several researchers on this topic, and since we are running out of time, I talked about the literature talking about the motivation and when do military men intervene and take over power, and also the tasks and requirements of successful coups, when they succeed, when they fail, and when the military retreats from politics. There's a lot of literature at this level, and in the Arab world, it's very important to talk about the strategies of coup-proofing. So the coup-proof strategies, and the literature focused on the Arab cases, and maybe we can talk about these during the discussion. During the democratic transition, there are some things that the literature talked about how to help military not hurdle transition. I will respect time. Of course, there's also the civil-military friction, the compliance, the mechanism to monitor the military, and the civil control over armed forces. As I have told you, there are strategies and different approaches to achieve civil control, but there's also criticism that the civil need also reform. So the subcategory or the subfield focuses on the oversight over or the oversight of military without taking into account the effectiveness of the civil. So having real democratic governments, and also there are external factors, explanatory, independent variables that we can talk about. One of the most important external factors, in my opinion, that are not highlighted are the intra-military relations without taking into account the politics and the training programs. And there are several things that prove that some people receiving this training are carrying out coups in these countries, and we have examples in the region. I will conclude here. So we do not have one theory or one concept. There is no agreement or consensus, because there is some generalization, and also there's diverging opinions even in developed countries. And there are a lot of researchers focusing on some factors without the other, and there are things relating to the nature of curricula and quantitative studies focusing on specific things. Thank you so much, and we can discuss further later. Thank you, Dr. Abdel-Fattah, for respecting time. We are actually running out of time, so this is why I will move to Dr. Risa Brooks. Dr. Risa Brooks is with us. Can you hear me, Dr. Risa? Can you hear me, Dr. Risa?
I can hear you, yes.
Hello. So I will be introducing Dr. Risa very quickly. Dr. Risa Brooks is Alice Charms Professor of Political Science at Marquette University in Wisconsin, United States. She studies civil-military relations comparatively with a special interest in the Arab world. She is the author of numerous works on civil-military relations in the region, including her paper Political Military Relations and the Stability of Arab Regimes in 1998. Dr. Brooks, the floor is yours.
Dr. Risa.
Hello, everyone, and thanks so much to the Doha Institute and Dr. Omar Ashur for having me today. I wish I could be there with you in person. I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is at this time 7:30 in the morning. So good afternoon to you and good morning to me. I also want to thank the prior speaker, Dr. Abdel-Fattah, for his wonderful overview of civil-military relations. I'm going to pick up on some of the themes and issues that he spoke about. And at this moment, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with my slides. Hopefully you're viewing them now. So I'm going to talk about the concept of political control of the military, focusing on the Arab world, and how political leaders sustain the support of the military and security apparatus in their leadership and in maintaining control over governance in the state. And I'm going to present some theory. I'll give you an example and apply some of that theory to some specific cases, Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria. So with that, let's see, am I able to advance the slides? Okay, here we are. I want to start out with a familiar example for you, though, which is the Arab Spring, which many people talk about. The events, of course, in late 2010, which start in Tunisia, and the sort of large protests against the then leadership of Ben Ali and Mubarak, and elsewhere in the Arab world. And most commonly within the scholarship, people focus on an apparent similarity between the Tunisian and Egyptian militaries, in which they withhold efforts to disperse the protests, let them go on, kind of stand aside. And in Syria, where a very different response is elicited by the military and security services, both, in which they work to sort of use force, forcible methods to help disperse the protests. And this difference between Tunisia and Egypt on the one hand, and Syria and elsewhere, is usually, people usually try to understand similarities in Tunisia and Egypt and then sort of look at and try to figure out, well, what's different about Syria or elsewhere? And that's sort of the starting point of a lot of this scholarship. What I'm going to sort of start out with in my example, setting up my presentation today, is that sort of comparison, even going back to the Arab Spring between the Egyptian and Tunisian militaries, is really false. It's not very effective. In fact, if you look at the role of the militaries in those two regime moments, you see very different things happening. Of course, the Egyptian military is very much involved in decision-making, in being consulted, ultimately arbitrates the end of that regime crisis with Mubarak's departure from office. While it doesn't use force on any protesters in this sort of mass public way, it is involved in some arrests and detentions, and there are various reports of that. The Tunisian military is very different. It is really on the margins of decision-making. It's sort of left out of the decisions that are made by Ben Ali and his colleagues. The Ministry of Interior Ministry plays a much stronger role in many respects. And the military doesn't engage even in any of these sort of more private kind of forms of violence. I think so one starting point is there are real differences there that I don't think are always appreciated within the dominant Arab Spring scholarship. Also, I think Syria is underappreciated. Why the different units in the military and security services coalesced and supported Bashar. I think if you look around the world with the kind of divisions and fractionalization that you see in the security services, it's much more common that the military, that system starts to break apart under mass protests. And there are examples from Asia, from elsewhere, that show this dynamic playing out. And so, and sometimes those units will split off, defect, and sort of coalesce with parts of society. And yet you have this very cohesive regime. So how does that happen? So that's sort of to introduce my theory, sort of a puzzle, and I'm going to return to this at the end. Here is my argument about why you see these kinds of differences. And I introduced this concept of strategy of political control, which I'll define for you in coming slides. But essentially, this is how the political leadership accommodates the military. And when I'm talking about civil-military relations, I'm talking very much about the relationship between the top leadership of the military and the top political leadership in the executive. So I'm talking about that relationship. And how does the political leader accommodate the military? What are the sort of strategies of political control for doing that? I'm going to hold off on talking about existing approaches for now because Dr. Abdel-Fattah did such a great job of that, but I could return to explain how my approach relates. Here is the sort of starting point to my theory. So the first step, that in a non-democratic regime, such as Egypt under Mubarak or Ben Ali's Tunisia, civil-military relations are actually quite complicated and have a lot of pressures on a political leader. They have to accomplish or maintain several things, which I call sort of imperatives. Just sort of a sample of these are four. They need to prevent for the long term any conspiracies from emerging within the military that might challenge their political leadership and their position in office. They need to ensure that military forces are going to defend the political leadership and the regime in the event of societal opposition, whether that's in large protests or in terms of other sort of internal security challenges. You need to know that the military is going to be the defender of last resort for the regime. Also, especially for those states that are facing internal security challenges or external threats, one needs to ensure, if you're a political leader, that the military is effective in armed conflict, that it actually can do its main job, which is to protect the security of the state as a whole. And a leader has to do all of this while also ensuring that they have the power to control governance, basically that they're not just a puppet of the military, that they can decide how resources are distributed to the public, to other members of their ruling coalition, that they have some governance power. So these are the four different things that a leader has to balance if they are in control to sustain their sort of power and authority as political leader. The concept of strategy of political control describes how leaders accomplish that. So how do they meet those imperatives? What can they do? And I am going to talk about three different strategies of political control. I'm going to give you examples from the region. The ones I've already spoken about, I'll return to those. And so basically I'm going to elaborate what each of these strategies are. All of them reflect a different bargaining relationship. That is sort of the deep kind of analytical framework that I'm building on, and you'll see that as I present them. They reflect different sort of bargaining situations between the military and political leadership to sort of in a very abstract sense. Not that the military and political leadership thinks of themselves as bargaining, but this is sort of the analytical metaphor that I'm using to help understand these relationships. Okay, so the first strategy of political control is when you have a very powerful military and essentially the political leadership has to negotiate actively with the senior leaders of that institution. The military tends to be very centralized. Corporate is the term that is used within the civil military relations literature, very hierarchical, cohesive. Because there's this sort of active bargaining with a powerful military, The political leadership will grant, or within the regime itself, the military tends to enjoy lots of economic benefits. Its officers live well, get special treatment, things like that. It tends to be that the Ministry of Interior is not as central or as visible or as well resourced as the military. So the military is the most important actor within these kinds of situations. Usually the military will have key roles within the state just to ensure that that deal is followed through on. They're really central in the apparatus of the bureaucracy or in the parliament in some ways, or in different parts of the state. You'll see active or retired military playing a really important role. So this sort of strategy of political control is maintaining your position by actively bargaining with the military, with a powerful military, and dealing with the military leadership. Here's the sort of example, the type sort of archetypical example that I'm talking about today, which is Egypt under Mubarak. Still today, I would argue this framework mostly applies as well in Egypt, but I'm going back for purposes of my example. And you see that if you look into the structure of civil-military relations, the sort of amount of benefits that are provided to the military within the state are really pretty exceptional for a lot of places in the world, the degree to which this is occurring. Things like special benefits to officers themselves, benefits to the military organization, not just to the officers, things like vast control over the economy, lots of institutional autonomy. So by this, I mean the military controls its internal processes pretty exclusively, and except for some decisions at the very top. So lots of independence in the state, lots of resources, and lots of control of key positions. So especially, we don't usually pay this much attention to it, but if you look at sort of the provincial level in Egypt, in local government, in different parts of the state, you have lots of military officers in key positions, kind of monitoring and ensuring that this sort of implicit bargain is being upheld. Of course, just to give you a classic example that many people will be familiar with, just the degree to which the Egyptian military is invested, is given control of big pieces of the economy. We don't actually know how big at that time or now. And these are just some of the products that are produced by the army. And this is part of that grand bargain, part of the accommodation that the Mubarak regime has made with the military at that time. This next strategy that I introduced briefly before, and now I'll discuss, is the containment strategy. In this situation, you still may have some bargaining, but the military is much, much weaker than in a grand bargain situation. So much so that the political leadership is able to basically impose a structure on how they want to work with the military. And what that structure looks like is usually what we think of as sort of the marginalization, pushing the military to a part of the regime, but kind of keeping it under wraps, so to speak. In this situation, you will see the Ministry of Interior is a much more politically influential and well-resourced entity. So unlike the military being kind of the top, most powerful, here the MOI is either above or equal to that military establishment. The military really isn't a central player in making decisions within the regime. It's an actor, but not the most important. And unlike in order to keep the military sort of limited in power, you don't see this sort of same economic role or other benefits being given to the military. That would give it power, and the regime very much wants to keep it limited on the side, sort of margins. There's all sorts of ways that the political leadership will then try to monitor the military. I could talk about those more. That's that last point on this slide. But essentially, you have containing the military's influence in the regime as the second strategy of control and allowing other parts to sort of dominate to keep it balanced. Okay. This is sort of indicative. Another archetypical case is under Ben Ali. You have the military's role and influence in regime institutions is very much constrained. There is very minimal role outside of the sort of formal professional jobs of the military in the state. The MOI is much larger, better equipped. I mean, just in a really almost extreme degree, some of the equipment that the forces within the Ministry of Interior have rivals or exceeds some of what is available to the military at that time. There are limits even on the number of general officers, which is quite unusual. No sort of chief of staff position, very much institutionally kind of keeping the military again, marginal in the regime, subordinating it to a civilian-led Ministry of Defense. A civilian-led Ministry of Defense is quite an unusual thing in this kind of setting, and so it's an indication of this sort of subordination of the military in the Ben Ali regime. The third type is a divide and rule strategy, which is when the bargaining relationship is not between this sort of cohesive military, but actually among individual military and security force leaders. So actually the political leadership will maintain direct relationships with sort of heads of important units in the military and sort of deal with them. And they will sometimes even be rivals with each other in important ways. That competition is actually really important because that's how the political leadership makes sure they don't collude with each other. And it also there are other things that are done. Sometimes there's this sort of use of ethnic or racial or religious sectarian sort of differences. Leaders will play upon that to try to keep the military allied, so only recruit from a particular sector of society in order to keep this competition, to manage it and prevent and keep everyone allied even while they're competing with each other. Okay, this is fairly abstract, so let me give you the example, which is Syria. And what you see there is, unlike, say, in Egypt or in Tunisia, you have these very powerful kind of individual security forces, units within the military that are headed by larger than life characters, well-known, influential people, and they are sort of independently, operate somewhat autonomously and are independently sort of tied to the regime. You see, sort of just to elaborate that a bit more, each of them sort of operate almost as private fiefdoms. There's been some really interesting work by Joshua Stacker that describes how sort of autonomous and powerful and influential these individual units become and what that looks like. There are lots of monitoring by military intelligence that happens in other places, but it's pretty extensive and intrusive here. And then the reliance of the regime on a specific sector of society, the Alawi, to staff key positions, now not exclusively, but many key roles, including family members as well, to try to ensure that this competitive system with these different sort of power centers remain allied with the regime and don't split off in the way that I mentioned that occurs in other situations, trying to bond those units to the regime. Why do regimes exhibit why political leaders have different strategies of control. It might seem like they can pick and choose, like select what they want, but in fact, there are a lot of factors that go into shaping which strategy kind of emerges and becomes dominant. The most important, I would say, is, or among the most important, is what role the military plays at the origins, at independence, in particular of the state. How important is it? Of course, the sort of contrast there between Egypt and Tunisia is rather stark, right? With in Egypt, a military coup in 1952, bringing the regime to power, and in Tunisia, it being much more negotiated, with the colonial power, the French, and not being sort of at the backs of the military. And that sets the stage for a very different relationship, for a different strategy of political control to be used. Other factors can matter too. I've listed them. Sometimes there'll be shocks, things that will shift the power of the military, or external or certain features of the state might matter. Sometimes political leaders experiment a bit. I would say that sort of roughly, this is just by illustration. I'm not going to talk about this, but if I were to start to think about variation around the Arab world, of course, I have Turkey in there as well, and Sudan, but generally, just sort of to give you some illustrations, I would say containment is much more likely, or that model really matches Tunisia, Morocco, Gaddafi. I think it was a quite unusual regime, but there were features of it there as well. Algeria, Egypt, and then Turkey, as I mentioned, more of grand bargain, and then the divide and rule, especially prior to 2003 in Iraq, Syria, and Sudan. That's how I would say those strategies of political control, if I were going to map them to different examples, how they might apply. So let me, just before I conclude right now, return to the Arab Spring, my initial example, and remind everyone, as I mentioned before, that the differences in the grand bargain are really apparent here. The protests grow.
Dr.
The military.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yes.
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay, I will go quickly. So essentially, the relationship between the military and political leadership, the grand bargain, the way that the military is accommodated is reflected in that central role that the military plays, even though it doesn't disperse the protests. It is really central and actually arbitrates the end. And that reflects that grand bargain. The breakdown of that grand bargain, if there are questions, I can discuss exactly how we could understand what happened in terms of that framework. Just to go quickly, in Tunisia, the sort of containment, the marginalization of the military to the periphery of the regime is really evident there too. Ben Ali's decision is not contingent on what the military wants. Military is not actually involved much in any of the management of the crisis that's occurring, and actually doesn't ever engage in any overt insubordination. There's sort of this moments of resistance. Again, I can return to that, but I think the containment model helps us understand the differences between Egypt, the grand bargain and containment, Egypt and Tunisia. And then after Ben Ali leaves, the military really hands off, at least at that time, and sort of defends the democratization process. Very different than the role that the Egyptian military will have, which will be to manage a regime transition at that point. In Syria, part of what goes on there is that the regime with this fractionalized system can't really manage the response. And many people did not foresee that there would actually even be protests there. But the security service react and overreact. And of course, several young teenage boys are treated very poorly, and this elicits or helps grow the protests. And part of this, again, ties back to the divide and rule dynamic. let me just conclude there since I have been running long. So I've argued today that variation in civil-military relations can be understood in terms of the strategies of political control on which a leader relies. It affects the way that the military responds, in particular regime crises, and I use different illustrations of Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria for that to show how the argument would apply. And then I would suggest, and maybe if you'd like to talk about this, that I think there are actually some interesting shifts occurring, certainly in Egypt and Tunisia, in what is happening there. And with that, I know I've talked long. Thank you for your patience, and I'll look forward to hearing the other presentations.
Thank you, Dr. Risa. شكرا على المحاضرة القيمة المميزة.
For your valuable presentation. We will now move to Dr. Ilir Kalemaj. Dr. Ilir is the Vice Rector and Chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of New York in Tirana, Albania. He obtained his PhD in Political Science with a specialization in International Relations at Central European University. At the university, he has regularly taught courses such as Topics in Security Studies, War and Peace. He has published several books and more than 50 scientific research papers in international journals and conference proceedings. Dr. Ilir, 20 minutes. شكرا بروفيسور عاشور على الدعوة الكريمة وعلى هذا المؤتمر القيم والمحاضرات القيمة.
Serbian Albanian civil and military relations as precursors to solve the Western Balkans conundrum. So here I analyze the post-1990 dynamic of the civil-military relations between Serbia and Albania. Why is that important? Western Balkans is a small region composed now of 6 countries. It's former Yugoslavian countries plus Albania, but since Croatia and Slovenia already joined European Union, we're talking about Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, North Macedonia, Bosnia, and as I mentioned, Albania. All of these countries are the size of Romania, but we are important because we caused World War I, and we're very important in World War II, so who knows what will happen in World War III. It is long considered to be the backyard of the European Union. And the events that caused the war in 1990s, that were basically Milosevic irredentist wars in former Yugoslavia. They range from outright genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina, ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, and war crimes in Croatia. In themselves, Albania and Serbia do not share a border, but they are the 2 most significant populations in the regions. Also, they have significant minorities in the neighboring countries, which is considered vital for the security of the Western Balkans. The integration of former paramilitaries were a big challenge for both Serbia and Kosovo. And while the international courts sought many of them for war crimes and crimes against humanity, some trials are still going on. Stable civilian control over armed forces is a primary requirement for democratic consolidation. Serbia, Kosovo, and Albania are still transitioning countries, hybrid democracies, and not yet with a fully enforced rule of law. At present, both Serbia and Albania has open negotiation for full accession, and the same thing with North Macedonia. North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Albania are part of NATO. Serbia refuses to join, while the other countries, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, are neither part of NATO nor European Union. On basically on the height of the Serbian irredentism in 1990s, civilian populations in Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo were targeted. Most of the heinous crimes against such civilian populations were committed by Serbian paramilitaries, such as Arkan's Tigers, but also regulars such as the Scorpion Unit, that was a notorious police reserve force within the Internal Affairs Ministry of Serbia, which massacred thousands of men and boys in Srebrenica, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo. Serbia, under Milosevic rule, engaged into a irredentist project to create the Greater Serbia after the inevitable dismemberment of Yugoslavia, and the irregular militia such as the Arkan's Tigers were heavily involved by state security to wreak havoc among civilian populations, particularly in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Also, the presence of paramilitaries, altogether the Serbian regulars, were used for ethnic cleansing of civilian populations, particularly in Kosovo. What happened with this? Actually, Scorpion unit was disbanded in 1999. Some of its former commanders were indicted in Serbian courts. Arkan's troops, paramilitaries, they were underground. They joined football hooligan clubs like they used to have before. Arkan himself was murdered. The current paper investigates this shift as well as the full reintegration of such militias into civilian life. And one of the surprising findings, contrary to initial hypothesis, is that neither KLA, in the Kosovo case, nor Arkan's Tiger were clear cases of demobilized militias. So none of them were, which means they did not turn into army units. Instead, they reintegrated with partial degree of success into civilian life. KLA was a prime example of transitioning into civilian life through vocational education and training, while Arkan's Tigers returned to the underworld. On the plus side, both Serbia and Albania are founding members of the Open Balkan Initiative nowadays with North Macedonia, which has greatly improved the relations between the countries. While on the other hand, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo do not participate into this project. Very briefly about paramilitaries. There are several definitions for that. I'm referring here primarily to Oxford Dictionary, which says that designating or relating to a force of unit whose function and organization are analogous or ancillary to those of professional military force, but which is not regarded as having professional or legitimate status. So this falls short of what Max Weber once called for the state to have monopoly of legitimate violence, legitimate being the key word here. Paramilitaries are often used as auxiliary forces that help the regular armies to commit actions that are extra-legal, not based on just war principles and defined as war crimes or crimes against humanity. This is basically, nowadays, very much in fashion because of Wagner Group and what they are doing in Ukraine, but not only, also in sub-Saharan Africa. There are many studies that point this out, that paramilitary violence is organized. For example, one author mentions that mass violence is often carried out according to clear divisions of labor between the civil and military wings of the state, but also crucially between military and paramilitary groups. In the case, so paramilitarism can be seen as the complex interaction between security agencies, political parties, and communities that constitute the sociological infrastructure behind paramilitarism. On the other hand, most of the senior ranks of the army do not recognize the action of paramilitaries. And they take distance from them, and this is what happened with the Yugoslav army, later transformed into Serbian army. They took distance from the actions of paramilitaries in Srebrenica because they were too heinous. They committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. And also, they take distance when they are faced with court charges, especially international courts. Failure to integrate paramilitary forces into regular army units, especially after war or conflict, can also present dangers for macro security for a state and may even lead to insurrections against the new regime. Unless the paramilitaries are fully integrated into civilian life, which is the best potential course of action, since it is a more smoother transition and demobilization. Two authors have noted, for example, in the case of Colombia, that ex-combatants in more participatory communities tend to have an easier time with social integration and feel less of a need to organize among themselves. This was also the case with Kosovo. So they returned into civilian life, successful integration, the former KLA soldiers, and this in turn created social capital through building trust, which is necessary for state institutions to thrive in the long run. On the other hand, differential institutional forms of military may affect political leadership, but also vice versa. That was also mentioned in the previous presentation. Political leadership may well instrumentalize the military in the long run, and not only during the military conflict, and this particularly happened to Serbia, which had the initial benefit of controlling the Yugoslav army. However, they collapsed due to Croatian counteroffensive called Operation Storm in 1995. Also, they faced difficult times when fighting Kosovar paramilitaries in 1998, 1999 in Kosovo. So what about the atrocities of Serbian paramilitaries in Bosnia and Kosovo? Very shortly, there is evidence, and this evidence came during the trial of Milosevic and other former political and military leaders. There is a close cooperation between Arkan Tigers, this paramilitary group, and the Serbian Volunteer Guard, which was a state, and Serbian state security. So this was established in the court. Two authors summarized the activity of these troops, and Arkan himself were saying that the man whose name was synonymous with cruelty without pity and with mass murder was called Captain Arkan, whose real name was Zeljko Raznatovic. He used to be basically sentenced for various crimes in various European countries during 1970s and 1980s. As the same author writes, when Arkan reappeared in Kosovo, his tigers were swimming through Albanian communities as they had in Bosnia. As in Bosnia, Arkan was encouraged by the Serbian government. It was at this point during the Kosovo onslaught that the Hague Tribunal elected to make the sealed indictment public. And another one was the Scorpion Unit that I mentioned briefly. They were part of Serbian Interior Ministry, but in all effect, they acted in a gray area and undermined in effect all clauses of just law, and they can be well designated as a paramilitary group as well. They conducted rape and other war crimes of civilians, which makes their crimes more heinous because they were part of state structures. As Una Sablagovic argues, an indicator of the connection between the unit and the Interior Ministry is the presence of ministry officials, specifically Vasilij Mijovic, a member of the ministry anti-terrorist unit known as the Red Berets, which later was called Special Operation Unit, in the same areas at the same time as members of the Scorpions. So they cooperated in the field. Also, in the Hague court, as Sablagovic tells us, the witness claims were cited in the first instant verdict in the trial of former head of Serbian state security, Jovica Stanisic, and the former commander of the State Security Special Operation Unit, Franko Simatovic, who were accused of overseeing units that committed crimes against the Croatian and the Bosnian War, among other alleged crimes. This showed the direct official command from the highest level of Serbian state security to these paramilitary units. Scorpion Unit did not commit war crimes only in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. They committed heinous crimes in Kosovo. For example, they killed 14 Kosovo Albanian civilian women and children in Podujevo in 1999. Reintegration of the Serbian forces later after the war. Actually, the Scorpion Unit, although behaved like a paramilitary unit, as we mentioned, was part of Serbian security forces, but later it was disbanded, and some of its main commanders were indicted in Serbian courts. Situation was different with Arkan's Tigers. They weren't behaved as a typical paramilitary group. The crimes were so horrendous that even the infamous General Mladic in Bosnia and Herzegovina, more than one occasion, tried to distance himself and his troops with Arkan's and his Tigers. And they continued well after the war until Arkan was killed. And there was another group actually called headed by Legia. Legia was a former commander of the Special Operation Unit and the former paramilitary commander. He was convinced for killing the Serbian Prime Minister after the war, Zoran Đinđić, and for killing the former president of Serbia as well, Ivan Stambolić, both of them because he accused them of being traitors. And they basically gave up Serbia and the fight for the greater Serbia. They had links with organized crime groups as well. There are, to some extent, serious security risks emanating from military and threatening political leadership in taking pro-EU and potentially pro-NATO stances. I can mention three brief examples. One of them has to do with Serbian world. It was also mentioned by Marzena before, the Ruski Mir, and also the Serbian world case that it was mentioned by the Serbian Minister of Defense. Also, he is threatened right now, Vučić, by the more extremist members of Serbian opposition, not to have a deal with Kosovo that would lead to mutual recognition. Also, the Night Wolves, which is a pro-Putin biker group in Kremlin. They have their branches now in Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Belgrade, as well as in northern Kosovo. Also, Wagner Group is operating in northern Kosovo. So there is strong links between the Russian and the Serbian. Serbia, by the way, is the only country in Europe, not just in the Balkans, who did not condemn the Russia aggression against Ukraine and who actually keeps open all lines of communication and not only. Because of lack of time, I'm not going to last long about KLA activities. Just mentioning very briefly that KLA did not transform itself. It was a disbanded militia as well. They created the Kosovar Security Forces. The Kosovar Security Forces are now turning into a Kosovar army. In 2018, they gave a 10-year period to be a fully trained army. And I talk here also about the cost of reintegration, which it was very modest and very successful, by the way. Without further ado, I'm going to the conclusions, actually. The conclusions, the Serbian-Albanian civil and military relations could lead to post-conflict resolution and peaceful relations, especially between Kosovo and Serbia. This, in turn, will enable these two countries, but also the other four countries in the region, to establish more normal relations. Serbia and Albania and Serbians and Albanians are the most numerous populations in the region. And of course, they have sizable minorities in adjacent countries. For example, Albanians are 33% of Republic of Macedonia, Northern Macedonia. So to conclude, for real, at present, both Serbia and Albania have opened negotiations for full accession to EU. Albania and Northern Macedonia and Montenegro are part of NATO. Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina want to be part of NATO, but are not, basically are sabotaging part of their territory by Serbia. Serbia refuses to join NATO. Well, all these 6 countries want to be part of European Union with various stages of success. So stabilization of relation between Serbia and Kosovo with the ultimate recognition of Republic of Kosovo, which is under the way because there is a Franco-German plan, will be the main guarantor of peace and stability in the relations between Serbs and Albanians, and as well as the rest of the region. Thank you very much for your patience in this late afternoon.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور إيلر.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ilir. Now we move to Dr. Alagha. Dr. Malath has a PhD from Exeter University, UK. He is expert in major power policies towards the Middle East, and his interests focus on the impact of the economy on the Turkish military defense and the impact of China's ascension in international relations. He has many articles, peer-reviewed articles. Dr. Malath, thank you very much, Dr. Sidi. After Dr. Abdel-Fattah regarding the military-civil relations, I will just add something new. The field relies on analysis from up, down, and the role of the military is an independent one, whether as a participant in the political work which impacts the state and also the army's strength, which adds to the state's strength, and because this field of knowledge started with the backdrop of the Cold War. In the state of the army, there is another thing, which is the unconventional role of the armies, like the Qatari army, so far as playing a role in providing aid, like the army in Qatar provides aid in Afghanistan, Lebanon, to the earthquake victims in Turkey, and as well as playing a peacekeeping role. So maybe we can say something about the cooperation between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Army's role in providing aid in the context of our thing, and that is the civil-military relation and the impact of the development of the defense industry in Turkey. In our reality, which is applicable to Turkey's situation also, the presence of the army in power was a symptom of an illness, and this is a reality in our Arab countries, and in Turkey it was like that in the past because led to investing in violence, the presence of and Arab countries into violence, into terrorism, failed states. So therefore, the Turkish society has reached an advanced stage in the relations between the military and the civil aspects of the country, and therefore impacted in making the country stronger in standing up to PKK and other terrorist organizations, and also in Turkey's role in foreign policy, like in Azerbaijan, Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, Ukraine, and therefore the Turkish military industries or defense industries are a source of strength. And because the relations, the military-civil relations, which were developed from 2002 to 2022, has contributed to the development of this military and defense, and this was the fruit of this relationship, to have, as a result of the military-civil relations, a defense industry which is of benefit to the country. In Turkey, for 8 decades since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the army was in power, represented in power through its role in the National Security Council. And you see the head of the civil administration is sitting next to the head of the National Security Council until Erdogan came to power, and all the previous leaders of the state were generals like Ataturk, Osman, Kafala, and by and large were generals, former generals, until Erdogan came to power in 2002. Therefore, controlling the military control over the civil authority was through a number of organizations like the National Security Council, which had a say in everything on the military side, political side, cultural, economic, whatever. The civil administration was like a secretariat. Then there was a secretariat of the National Security Council was established, which was like a cabinet, another cabinet, and the Security Council used to take the decisions, and the Secretariat informed the Council of Ministers of it. So they were more important and they were in actual control. The Justice and Development government has gone through a bitter struggle with the military. This was based on the model of confrontation and containment at the same time, and through the legislation, through the legislative arm of the state, there was a share of responsibility which led to shrinking the role of the army in the political life of the country. So therefore, the professionalism of the army and the control of civilians over the country was the fruit of this new type of relationship. For example, if we look at it from the point of view of the military, the ruling military, it was the model of confrontation. The Justice and Development had an approach of containment also, and reaching compromises and middle of the road solutions. And this is what led to real military civil relations. This is based on certain pillars. The first pillar is popular legitimacy, which was linked to the earthquake of 1999. Before this current earthquake, there was another earthquake which led to the catastrophe of the earthquake and the Buland Ajavid's government's weakness led to the popularity of the Justice and Development Party, which came to power soon afterwards. So therefore, after 2 decades, we can see a similarity. The other thing is in the last 8 decades where the army had control, weakened the army, and the army therefore was unable to stand up to terrorism like the PKK internally and also the leftist organizations. So there, the army was unable to hold the reins of civil power, and this led to the army going on the retreat gradually because the civilian government wanted to provide security for the masses, and which the army couldn't. The other thing was the membership of the European Union, which the Justice and Development Party utilized, because one of the conditions is for the army's role to shrink and the civilian role to be strengthened. 2003 saw the Justice and Development Party removed the National Security Council and the Secretariat of the National Security Council, removed them from the executive power into an advisory role or supervisory role. Also, in the past, the head of this National Security Council was in the hands of the army, and then in 2004, the first civilian was appointed to head the National Security Council for the first time since 1934. Also, the General Secretariat of the Council's status was changed, and the National Security Council was an authority which is under no supervision whatsoever, neither from the state or the parliament or any other entity. Also, they had their control over the media, the TV and radio and the education system. This is the first stage. And there were 2 military coups, and there were some attempts of a soft coup in 2007 and in 2008 through the judiciary. And these were overcome by the 2 referendums. Then came the failed coup attempt, which provided a golden opportunity for the Justice and Development Party to get rid of all the generals that they did not approve of. The democratization process led to empower the city in strengthening the military industry, defense industry, through a better governance, and made the government or the state be in charge of the defense industry and place it under civilian leadership instead of the military. So the civilians run the defense industry. The approach in the past was that they used to produce based on the threat analysis into a need-based analysis and production. And the best example of that is the Bayraktar drones now. Also, the budget, the military budget, was increased through the control of the government over the military industrialization fund, and the army in Turkey, called the establishment of the Turkish army, which is a major partner in defense industry, and it is now under total civilian control and got rid of the military control, and this also helped develop the military industry. And the military industry was integrated into the civil industry through the development plans 10th and 11th, and this integration between the civil and the military industry sectors have the main product of that of the Tuk car and the development of many medical instruments and equipment, which was the fruit of cooperation between the civilian and the military. Ismail Damir says the following. He is the head of the national industry. He says, all this development was due to placing the industry under civil control. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Malath. We have 10 minutes. We will take 4 minutes for questions and 6 minutes to the panelists. And please, we do not want interventions, just one short, direct, pointed question. Dr. Jawdat. سؤالي تعريف من هو العسكري ومن هو المدني؟ دكتور بروك أول متحدثين اثنين.
الدكتور الأستاذ سيف وبعدين الدكتور مهند.
شكرا.
Thank you, Dr. Sidahmed. This is a general question and anybody can answer it. Can we consider the ex-military leaders, like retired generals, can we consider them as part of the military elite? Retired military generals, they run for politics. Can we consider them military because their mentality is military, or we say that because they took off their uniform, they become civilian? For example, Abdel Nasser will be a civilian, and Sisi, when he resigned from the army and become civilian. My second question is a very sorry. So, yes. هذا سيكون باللغة الإنجليزية. هي
In the revolution of 2011 in Egypt, does she consider that the military intervention assisting the revolution, especially in July 11th in 2011, when they somehow enforced Mubarak to step down and to hand the authority to the supreme military, is it like was it a backdoor for military or for the army just to get back into politics, or this was clearly a military coup then? And thank you so much.
شكرا. دكتور مهند. بعدين.
Thank you very much. I'll ask my question in English.
Is included in the civil-military relations field or subfield, and if it is, is it under the same theoretical and methodological frameworks? Is it studied under the same frameworks? And if it is not if it's not part of the civil-military relations, is there a subfield of civil intelligence relationship?
For whom? الأستاذ تفضل.
الو الدكتور مولاي عبد الله، انا سؤالي عن
هل هناك دراسة to whom is it directed? General question, anybody can answer it. Are there any studies, maybe Dr. Abdel-Fattah can answer this, are there specific studies which are done to analyze the elements why the military tends to control the political? Is it something psychological? Do they want to have control simply because they have the weapons and the power? Okay. Two questions from our students. Assalamu alaikum. My question to Dr. Abdel-Fattah or Dr. Malath is the nature of military civil relations in the Sudan and the American support is a new strategy to support the civilians instead of the military like the past, or is the military in Sudan becoming aware of the role of the civilians in political life? Assalamu alaikum. Question to Dr. Malath. Is the integration of military and democratic process a model which can be applied elsewhere? We can stop here. We are running very, very late. So therefore, I give 2 minutes to each panelist to respond. We start with Dr. Risa. If she can hear us.
I can hear you. Thank you.
نعم أستطيع أن أسمعكم. شكرا. تفضلي.
Should I speak? Oh, okay. To be brief, I'll just respond to a couple of the points. I do think that it is important that when former military leaders remove their uniforms, they do take on more responsibility for the state as a whole. But I think in the case of Sisi or Nasser, the main issue there is that they retain such ties to the military, and the military is an important backing of the regime, and therefore them taking off the uniform has some significance, but not as much as if the military wasn't such an important player in how they sort of negotiate with the military. In terms of the revolution in 2011, my view is that the military never didn't support the protesters for their cause. They supported the protesters for their own organizational kind of self-interest and turned against Mubarak for that reason. And they never completely ever stood away and let the democratic process kind of unfold without sort of managing it. They were behind the scenes then. So they never really lost power. And in fact, they gained power if you look at the constitutions and sort of the new prerogatives granted to the military at that time. Last, I'll just say in terms of intelligence studies, it isn't usually included in civil-military relations, but I agree that that's a really fruitful area that might be explored. And with that, I'll pass on to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Abdel-Fattah.
Dr. Abdel-Fattah, thank you very much. I thank you all. So far as the question of who, it's not a question of who is military or civilian as definition. The question is who has the power, the weapons, and the ability to penetrate. I think this links both the military and the civilian with the intelligence apparatus. Sometimes they are more powerful in the Arab world than the armies themselves. We don't know, but this can be the case because we cannot are available. Generals taking off their uniforms, for example, it depends on the political system. In the US, France, and Europe, they become civilian, but in the Arab world, these generals, whether they in uniform or not, they still are a tool in despotism. Also, I mentioned the intelligence agencies. Now they are linked to the reforming of the security sector, which is linked to the military, to the civilian, and there are studies which focused more on the military side in the past, and maybe there should be more focus on the intelligence aspect. There are some studies on the psychological things, their feelings of power. Some is linked to inferiority complexes by some people when they're at a young age. When they come to power, they do not want just a military rule. They want one person, individual rule. I don't know. The Sudan question wasn't directed to me. I'm not an expert in it. But does America support the civilian component? I don't think the United States wants deep changes towards democratization. They just want the best governments that can achieve their interests. This is a long story, but in Sudan, it happened many times that one person led coups, and this is an open question to research. Ilir? نعم، سؤال واحد يعود أو يوجه إليه فيما يتعلق بالاستخبارات. كانت هناك حالة مع جيش تحرير كوسوفو.
Turned into state security service entirely after the war. So that was the only reintegration, partial reintegration of the militia into state institution.
دكتور ملاث.
حياك الله، شكرا. بخصوص سؤال الدكتور مهند سلوم.
Dr. Mohanad Saloom's question, if we take the SMERCH model in the Soviet Union, because it's an intelligence apparatus which impacted the Communist Party. So when we study it, we must study it within the military. It was Stalin's arm to control over the state, the military. SMERCH was an example. As the difference between what's military and what's civil in politics, the right to have the right of compulsion. Anybody who has that, very simply, who has the right of power, the right of compulsion, compelling people, can be considered a military, even if it's the police or belongs to some organizations like sometimes the Constitution allows people to take up arms to defend their neighborhood, for example. They considered military. Maybe this is a simple definition we can use here. Regarding the Sudan, in my opinion, is like the difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. The Republican Party wants to military government. The Democratic power wants the minimum of military power or military democracy with some military power. As for the relationship between the first wall and third wall and investing in the army, we see that in Africa, even in Russia, they do the same regarding Syria, regarding Haftar. Investing in armies nowadays is the part of the relationship between the first war And third world. As for integrating the military and the civil aspects is related to the economy. Without this integration, no country can be strong enough. Starting from the United States post-World War II, the integration of the military industry and the industry, civil industry with the military, and also China, and they have the same. Now the United States is worried about China's integration. The same thing applies to Turkey and how Biden spoke before the elections that this integration between the military and civilian in Turkey is a threat to the US. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Finally, I have to thank all the speakers, Dr. Abdel-Fattah, Dr. Elisa, Dr. Ilir, Dr. Malath, for their presentations. And I apologize for not taking more questions. And I apologize for keeping you. We now have come to the end of the second day's deliberations. See you tomorrow.